Our gospel reading comes from the book of John, chapter 5, verses 1 through 18, which you can find in your bulletin. After this, there was a festival of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, there is a pool, called in Aramaic Bethesda, which has 5 porticos. In these lay many invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take your mat, and walk." At once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Now that day was a Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your mat." But he answered them, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Take up your mat and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take it up and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had disappeared in the crowd that was there. Later Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you have been made well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. Therefore the Jews started persecuting Jesus because he was doing such things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is still working, and I also am working." For this reason the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but was also calling God his own Father, thereby making himself equal to God. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I'm really serious. That was the climax of the service. This is over the course of the next few months, we're going to be exploring 3 questions. And this is something I've mentioned in the past. It's something that I'm sure to talk about again. But I want to reiterate it here, that we have 3 questions that we're going to engage to try to find out how better we can do God's will in the world. The first question is, who is Simpsonville Christian Church? If each one of us is unique and all of us are unique, then that means that this church is unique. It's the only one like it in the history of the world. Simpsonville Christian Church in Simpsonville, Kentucky at 2013 is different and unique from all other previous versions and future versions of it. So what is it that makes us what we are? The second question is, what is it that this community needs? What are the needs of this town, Simpsonville, Shelbyville, this county, this country, this world, which likewise is very distinct and different than any other previous or future versions of it. And then the third question is, what are we going to do about it? Knowing who we are and knowing what the needs of this community and this world are, what is the intersection? How is it that we've been called uniquely to address the urgent needs in the world around us? And I think the reason that it's important for us to answer those questions is that this is what is going to provide the reference points. These are going to be ways that we can stay focused. These are the ways that we're going to derive our energy and our mission and our vision for what it means to be God's people in the world as Simpsonville Christian Church. Now, it's interesting, as you begin to ask yourself these questions, the world starts to look a little bit differently. And I don't mean to say that these questions change the world, it just changes the way that we see the world. And to give you an example, as I've been asking this question of myself, who is this church? Who am I as the leader of this congregation? And what are the needs of the world? I've come to recognize, for example, that people come into this church building on a pretty regular basis asking for assistance. So every week, 1 or 2 times a week, we'll have somebody come in who says that I need food, or I have children and they need food, or I need a little bit of gas money to get to wherever it is that I'm going. Some people say that I've fallen behind on my rent and I'm about to be kicked out of my home and I'm looking for some type of assistance for rent or utilities or whatever. And I've asked other ministers about this, and I've found out that we're not unique. This is something that all of the different congregations in this area also experience. And the question becomes, how is it that we should respond? Now, before I go any further, I just want to acknowledge that just in the small time that I've been here, I've recognized that this congregation does do things. And the food drive that we're going to begin on Mother's Day next week in order to build a food pantry is just one small way that we are going to respond to one small need. And it takes all of us. It takes the leadership of the women of this church. It takes the skill of those who can help the facilities accommodate that food pantry. But there's a question in the larger picture: how is it that we can form a response to the needs in this community? Well, the passage that we heard this morning, we have Jesus in Jerusalem, and he goes to the pool at Bethesda. Now, at the pool of Bethesda, apparently we have all kinds of sick and infirm people lying around. And Jesus sees one man, and he singles him out. And the man has been ill for 38 years. And we don't know why the man is ill. It doesn't say. And this man doesn't grab Jesus and say, "Jesus, come over here and help me." Jesus finds him. He's sitting at this pool, and Jesus finds him, and the text says that he knows that he has been ill for a long time. And Jesus asks the man, "Do you want to be made well?" Now, I think that's interesting, because Jesus already knows that the man is sick. He already knows that he has been ill for a long time. And yet he still stops to ask him. He doesn't presume to know what the willingness of this man is. Do you want to be made well? Now, maybe we can identify with the man who has been ill, or we know people who are like the man who has been ill, but we can't always take for granted that somebody who is ill, either physically or emotionally or psychologically, wants to be made well. Some people identify with their illness so strongly that they find it very hard to let go of an illness they know in order to embrace a healing that they cannot imagine. So it's important that he gets the man's response, "Do you want to be made well?" And the man responds. He doesn't say yes or no. What he says is, "Well, you see, I can't get over into that pool." It's not quite the question Jesus was asking. He says, "Do you want to be made well, yes or no?" And the man says, "Well, I can't get over into that pool." And this reveals the preconceptions that the man has about what it is that's going to make him well. You see, this pool, the legend had gone, is that an angel would reach down and stir the waters. And whenever the people would see bubbles start to come up in the waters, everyone would make a mad dash to get into the waters. And maybe this man has been traveling his whole life to get to this magic healing pool. Maybe he's seen people go into the pool and come out seemingly better. But regardless, we find that when Jesus says, "Do you want to be well?" he interprets the only way that I can get well is to get into that pool, and you see, I can't get into that pool. Now, maybe we can identify with that. Maybe when someone asks us, "Do you want to be made whole?" we say, "Well, I haven't found that special man or woman yet." It wasn't quite the question. "Do you want to be happy?" "Oh, happy? Well, you see, I haven't made enough money yet." "Do you want to be happy?" "Well, you see, I'm still waiting on that job promotion or that big break." "Do you want to be made whole?" "Well, you see, retirement is still 10 years away." So Jesus gets this kind of answer, and what does he do? Does he say, "Okay, I'm going to another guy at the pool"? No, Jesus understands that this man does not know where the healing will come, and yet he still chooses to heal him anyway. Immediately he says, "Stand up, take your mat, and walk." Jesus reveals his power and he reveals his willingness to heal, even when we misunderstand where that healing will come from. I think that tells us something very important about the nature of God. But you see, that's not the end of the story. You see, after this scene that we have where the man is told to take his mat and get up and walk, we have verse 9. You see, before this point, we have a nice, contained healing story. We can take this healing story, we can put it in our pocket, we can say, this shows that Jesus loves us, that Jesus heals us, that Jesus doesn't play 20 questions to decide who's worthy and who is not. We can take this self-contained unit with us and go on our way. But then there is verse 9. Actually, there is just the second half of verse 9. And what the second half of verse 9 says, now that day was the Sabbath. It's an interesting detail that the author decides only to throw in right now. Why couldn't have this been introduced in the beginning? Oh, this is the Sabbath and Jesus goes to the pool, etc., etc. No, John waits until this moment after the healing has occurred and says, now that day was the Sabbath. And I think we're meant to pay attention to that, because all of a sudden this healing story that we have becomes a conflict story. It says that the Jews find the man who has been healed and says, "You, what are you doing carrying that mat? You can't do that. That's not lawful on the Sabbath day." And he says, "The man who healed me told me to carry it." And then the authorities suddenly don't care about this man. Say, "Who told you that? Who told you could carry this mat?" "Oh, I don't know." Then later on the man bumps into Jesus, and then he goes back to the Jews and he goes, "Jesus is the one. Jesus is the one that made me well." So they go to Jesus and they begin to persecute him for doing these kinds of things on the Sabbath. The Sabbath and Sabbath observance cannot be understated in terms of how important it was for Jews of this era. In addition to circumcision and obeying the food laws, Sabbath observance was foundational for the identity of the people in this day. It was the primary way that people showed their obedience to God in this Sabbath observance. Now, do you think Jesus didn't know that? Not likely. Do you think Jesus just didn't realize what day of the week it was? I mean, why couldn't have Jesus said, "All right, buddy, meet me here tomorrow at 8 a.m. and I'm going to heal you"? No, he knows what he's doing. He intentionally chooses the Sabbath to perform this healing. Now, why in the world would he do that? Well, Jesus heals when Jesus heals. Jesus doesn't obey our time schedule. Jesus doesn't obey our calendar. Jesus makes the decision of when he is going to touch us and when he is not. And if it didn't happen on the Sabbath, then we would miss something very important about the nature of Christ. We would miss something very, very significant about who Jesus is and what his identity is. You see, even the Jews of this day know that the Sabbath was for us, for humans to stop working. The Sabbath wasn't meant for God to stop working. And God is always working. You see, the sun shines and the moon rises and the rain falls, whether it's the Sabbath day or not. Babies are born and people go on to the afterworld on the Sabbath. God's work does not stop on the Sabbath. And if Jesus had not performed this healing on that day, we would miss the crucial element, which is that Jesus says, "My Father is still working, and so I am still working." Now the Jews interpret this as blasphemy, which is kind of ironic, because blasphemy would be to assert that someone was claiming equal power and independence of God. But what Jesus is claiming here is a radical obedience and a radical dependence upon God. If the Father works, then I work. I am the agent of the Father, Jesus says. You see, Jesus performs this healing because that is who he is. The Father sent him as the Father's agent in the world, and Jesus could no more not heal on the Sabbath than a tree could not be a tree, that a tree could cease being a tree. Just as sure as the grass is green and the sky is blue and the water is wet, Jesus performs healings. It's a part of his identity. And I think going back to our original question, there's something that we can take out of this story, that when we understand what it is that we are supposed to do in the world, that too flows from our identity. It flows from who we are. When we decide who we are going to be as Simpsonville Christian Church, it's not a matter of looking across the street and saying, well, that's the way they do it, and we kind of like what they got, so we're going to imitate that. No. God made us exactly the way that we are for a reason. And to say that we would rather do what they're doing over there is to say to God that I like what you've made, God, but I think I can do a little better. I think we found a better model. I think we found something across the street that we would rather be rather than what you created us to be. You see, our sense of mission, our sense of purpose, our sense of vision will come from who we are created to be. It's already embedded in our DNA. That is how God created us, exactly how God created us. And what we need to do is to seek out what that is, to understand it, to know it, to not try to be something that we're not, but to discover who we are and let our mission flow from that. And it will be just as unique as any other church on the planet. Now, this is where I would show you an example of what that looks like. But that's up to all of you and to all of us to answer. And I think that the answers are here. The answers are sitting in these pews. The answers will come when we engage that intentional search, that intentional discovery of our own identity. And just in the short time that I've been here, I've already begun to sense what it is that we have. I've already been able to sense some of our values and some of our strengths, some of the things that make us unique. Our passion for youth, our exceptional musical talent, our commitment to pass down values like hospitality and hard work and love and patience across the generations. These should give us clues as to who we are. I was telling somebody a few weeks ago, if somebody asked me my opinion today, who is Simpsonville Christian Church? What I would tell them is, come worship with us on the third Sunday of the month. And then stay afterwards. I'm serious. In fact, you can skip the service. I mean, if you really want to know who we are, if you really want to know our heart, if you really want to know our sense of community and our love and our mutual affection, come to one of our fellowship meals, because you will feel it all there. Sermons are great, don't get me wrong, but if you really want to know the heart of this congregation, come eat with us. Come celebrate a meal with us. Feel that community. And I have to wonder, if someone were to ask you, who is Simpsonville Christian Church? How would you respond? Amen.